kind of sorted the questions by different categories, and I think the best that we could. And we're just going to kind of go through each. What are we going to do? We're going to do each category. Yeah. Okay, so this category is about talking to our parents about dating. So it says, if your parents are very against the idea of casual dating, what would be the best way to approach the topic without being disrespectful to them and their opinions?
I would, okay, now we have not heard these questions, and in all the years I've done this is a new question.
Oh.
Which, okay,
Right.
It's yours. Okay. So I would, in my ideal world, assuming that you actually can have real conversations as a young adult with your parents, I would ask them why. I would ask them what they think casual dating means. I'd explain to them what I thought it meant and why I do it simply to enjoy other people of the opposite sex. And I would explain to them that it allows me to socialize and to begin a sense of how to communicate to a person of the opposite sex in a very safe, non-committal, non-sexual, non-exploitive relationship. And I'd try to gently convert them to that vision. But my hunch is that if you're college age, they're probably concerned about you're too young to get married, we want you to get through college, or we know you're really emotionally, not very settled, and so we'd like to keep you out of danger, or they just really hate the thought that you're ever going to leave them. And so depending on their motives, it'll help you figure out how to have a meaningful conversation with them, and it'll help you understand them. If you're dependent on them financially and all, then I think you do have to think through your child-adult relationship, emerging adult relationship, and what is wise there. But I think it's good to start having adult conversations with them. That would be my thoughts.
I guess I would just add that I think what parents really like is the fact that you would come and ask them for advice is huge. Because a lot of times when students leave, sometimes they have the idea that because you're students now and you're getting older, you're growing adults, is that you already know the answers. And so when you come and ask for wisdom, that will make your parents really feel good. And also respected that you would come. You might not like what they say, but I think your attitude in coming humbly to them and just saying, Mom and Dad, you've lived a lot of life together, and they might even have different values that you have, but still to just hear them out and so they can share their wisdom with you, I think goes a long ways. And then you can decide afterwards, like, is this is this what I want to listen to? Is this good advice or not? But just asking them, I think, is huge.
Okay, cool. Next question. I believe this isn't about parents anymore. I believe strongly that we choose who we love. Love is a decision. I've been on dates with multiple ladies, and I'm still attracted to them similarly. How should I I'm not laughing at the question. I'm laughing at me saying it. How should I base my decision on who to pursue? How do I choose who to love like that?
No, this is just us figuring out who's going first, so you don't think I'm dominating husband. I just give Shirley permission each time to say, you go first.
I like him to go first because he's very quick to answer. He's usually got something right in his head, and I'm a much slower processor, so I need more time. So it's not that he's dominating. I like him to go first. So that's how we operate.
Plus, that way I have to repent of saying things quickly, and she always looks really, really bright. Be careful, guys. They're a lot smarter than we are, So, okay. The thing that struck me in the question is, yes, there is an aspect of love that requires at times that it be very willful, worser times, etc. And I agree fully with what the guys communicated this morning, that it is likely that we could find good, positive, kingdom, love, and compatibility with more than one person. In fact, we know that for a fact because we know people who are widowed very young and remarry and have very meaningful, enriching lives with more than one mate without violating any of the moral values of the kingdom. When I hear a young man, of which I still can remember when I was, and I dated a lot, I was pretty frenetic as a young believer. I was infatuated with everybody I went out with. But if I could love any of them, then my question would be, why didn't you just stick with the first one? Why be running around shopping or whatever you are doing? And is it really true that we can just marry anyone? And so I'm not sure I'm convinced of the premise that love is just simply willful in the romantic realm, or that we're compatible with everybody just because we both know Jesus. And so my hunch is that when I dated for a while and then would move on, it was usually because I'd either become emotionally disinterested, and so I really didn't think it was just willful. I thought emotions were important as well, probably too important in my case. And so I think there's something there for the person that asked the question to, perhaps unravel with an older brother that is in your community to why have you dated many women that you like them all and think you could marry any of them, but you keep moving around. There's something else going on in your heart and mind there, and I don't know what it is. Could be good, might be sketchy.
I just think there's so much discovery that comes as you spend quite a bit of time becoming friends before you make that decision about, choosing to love. I mean, Brady and I were friends for about 2.5, almost 3 years, very platonic friends, and we learned a lot about each other, what our values were and all, and so I agree with him. I think that you can't. There's a lot of people that I wouldn't choose to love because they have way different values than I about money or about children or about what I want to do with my home, how open my home wants to be. I just couldn't make that decision about a lot of people because they have different values. So
I think one thing an example of that, and when Shirley says I wouldn't choose to love, she means I wouldn't choose to marry. She's quite committing to loving people in Jesus' name. An area that would maybe be an example of this is that I watched Shirley as a late 20-something single mom. I watched the dedication she had to children. It wasn't theoretic. I could observe the character quality. I watched her openness of her home, even though she was just about as poor as a church mouse, because the ex wasn't responsible to even support, and the state wouldn't enforce it. And yet she welcomed young girls into her home very readily. She wasn't possessive of her possessions. In fact, if anything, she was challenging, even in my own thinking, about what it meant to be free from the possessiveness of things. And so I could see worked out character in her, and before when I dated, it was so theoretic. And so, theoretically, girls would say that they were unpossessive and they didn't care about stuff and they wouldn't rather be shopping and all that. But as I dated for a while, I found out that wasn't yet a settled reality. It was more of a hope and a vision. And so I think there's a real difference that as you dig down in what's actual character, you have to be careful of the difference between aspirational character and what has begun to really be grown. And so for me, there were things that were deep values. They weren't aspirations of what I hoped I'd grow into. They were values. And in the end, my growth of love for Shirley was that we actually shared those foundational values, not in theory, but in fact. And it's one of the benefits of marrying a bit later. You actually have a life to look at, that how did you live with your own money on your own time and stuff, you know. And so we found that very helpful, you know, and it has played itself out. I am very, very thankful that Shirley is not a possessive person, that in our entire married life, I have never felt that I had to think about God's direction in my life in terms of keeping her happy in the material realm. She was quite willing to live the vision of simplicity, and I saw that already in her life. Okay, and I do think you can see it in younger people's lives. You can discover their generosity of how they volunteer time, their generosity of how they use their money, their generosity of whether they've got to be shopping at Nordstrom's in Seattle, you know, or whether they can shop at Goodwill and buy Nordstrom's from other girls who threw their stuff away every year. You know, how smart are they and stuff? So, you know, that's probably enough said about that.
This question kind of relates to that. It says, how do you go about deciding who you're truly compatible with?
You decide by facts. This is where it's probably good to be a scientist instead of a literary major. Okay? The fact is that compatibility, okay, here's our theory, and some of you have heard our pizza theology on this. You want to have a lot of connectivity in vital virtues. Okay? Think of spoons. In the vital values, the really, really important values, in a sense, the unchangeable values, the values you hope will actually grow and deepen even more. You want the spoons to be laying inside each other, the way you'd stack a spoon, so that all that metal's touching. And so for me and for Shirley, the vital virtues are love for God that is motivated not by the other person's love for God. It's re-engaged and re-encouraged by it. But I didn't go to church or get involved with Jesus because Shirley was dragging me to it, nor vice versa. Okay? And so our love for God. Well, now, this love for God, how does it get worked out? And you heard the comments by Garrett. Number two causes of divorce are communication and money. Okay? And so, you know, it happened to be that the virtues we looked for was the openness and the commitment of communication. And so I had to figure out if I could get in touch with my feminine side enough to actually communicate in a way that was fulfilling and connective for Shirley. And she had to figure out if she could, you know, communicate with me in a meaningful way as a man. We already alluded to financial values, incredibly important. Children, incredibly important. If I was going to marry Shirley, I was actually going to make covenant with a woman who had 2 children, and I had to say, can I take them in and welcome them as my own and love them as my own? And when we have our own biological children, that they will not be displaced. Could I willfully and consciously and morally do that? You know, I couldn't. I shouldn't marry her. And she knew that as well. Where our culture has put emphasis is, how cute is he or is she? How big are his muscles? How much cleavage? You know, and do they like the same pizza and the same movies? And none of that matters to Shirley and I. Well, I think it matters to her how good looking I am, but, you know, apart from that, you know.
So good looking.
No, she wasn't worried about it. Faithful hound dog is what she wanted. Faithful was the virtue, not good looking. Okay?
Some things have to be non-negotiable, I think. And there's other things that as you discover about each other that you simply at the end make a decision, can I live with this? There might be some quirks. I mean, Brady didn't have any, but I had some. That, you know, there might be a little annoyances that you become aware of. I mean, we find this in pre-engagement class all the time, you know, going through 12 weeks with couples. Then they discover, ooh, I didn't know that about you. And then they have to decide, well, can I live with that the rest of my life? And some things that are major, not quirks, but major things, sometimes they decide, I don't want to live with that the rest of my life. But there's some other ones that they decide, yeah, I choose to do that. I'll choose to live with you because I know that about you, and I don't expect you to change. That was great this morning, by the way, because a lot of couples think that once they go to the altar that, I don't know, voila, something's going to happen. And it doesn't. I mean, you hope for good change, positive change in Jesus, but sometimes the habits and stuff won't change. So, but I think it's fine to have those non-negotiables and just stick to them, but realize that there are other things that you can choose if you're going to live with or not.
I think we've probably, in some ways, boiled it down to a couple of measures we look for when we're doing premarital. Oh, yeah, I'll go back. Oh, yeah, the other thing, Shirley described the other side. The spoons lay inside each other on fundamentals, and on compatibility, they hit the rims, right? And so they're touch points. They're bridge builders, but they're not essential. You can discover and you can build a bridge the fact that Shirley does not like movies, which I know makes her suspect as a human being, and I love movies. And that Shirley loves knitting, and I have never knit. And so I watch movies, and she goes and knits. Okay? We can live with this. We don't do everything together. We weren't real concerned whether we studied the Bible the same way together. But we were concerned whether that we actually learned and obeyed the Bible a lot. Okay? And so there's negotiation, in a sense, on the non-essential values. That we would call places where we're compatible, but other places you actually have to share the value. Okay? And the other thing, I think there's emotional kinds of issues here, or they play into emotionality, and that's the ability to sustain high regard. Okay, when you really look at, and when the sociologists start breaking down, well, they're not capable of communicating. What they really mean is they're not capable of resolving conflict. And so they quit communicating. Or they say, well, they're not really compatible in their financial values. What that usually means is somebody is a spender and kind of a clothes horse or a big boy toy guy or gal, and the other person has other values or virtue of how they would use their resources, and they can't navigate, they can't build the bridge, and so the other person sees the person in a lower sense of esteem, because in the end, we love what we highly value. And so there has to be that sense, can I sustain high regard? And I think the other thing that we really look for is inevitably we fall short. That's why we make covenantal vows that hold us together. We inevitably fall short. The capacity to forgive is essential to the ability to sustain high esteem of the other person. And without high regard, relationships drift apart. Without forgiveness, high regard can't be sustained. And so those are some of the things that whirl around in our thinking. And whirled around in our thinking as we dated one another.
Great. Well, at first it's a great idea to be attracted to someone's character. Would you think that as you grow to know your significant other, that physical attraction should grow?
Well, at this point, at my age now, if I was attracted, I was single, I was attracted to somebody on their good character, I would hope that the physical attraction would show up sometime. When I was your age, the physical attraction, I never had to worry about that, except I had to lasso it and beat it into submission, I think that there are people who marry without a lot of romantic sexual attraction, and they grow into very deep lovers, physical lovers. But in the end, it's my general proposition that nobody marries anybody where on walking up to the altar you need a barf bag. We've counseled a couple hundred couples. I've done 130 weddings, And I've just never found anybody going, okay, there is no physical attraction here. I love this woman's character, this guy's character. It doesn't matter what kind of body at all they're in. It just doesn't matter to me. I'll throw up later in private. That's not how it works. The problem in our culture is we so overestimate the issue of sexual drive and the DNA of our sexuality and what we think is attractive that we pass by all kinds of people that we really could come to love deeply because they don't meet some physical image. And Proverbs warns us that beauty is fleeting, that everything's going to go south, and wrinkles are inevitable unless you're going to spend a whole lot of God's money on tummy tucks and Botox, which I think is really quite criminal. Okay? And so you got to become a little more realistic in that sense because the culture is so unrealistic. Are we having an earthquake? Okay. So those would be some of the things that would come to my mind.
We have a great story to tell about someone who wanted Brady to suggest people. They were, I think he was an intern that year.
Yeah, wanted me to be
and he wanted Brady to be the matchmaker.
Serious.
Yeah.
Serious.
And so Brady suggested this really godly woman in our ministry. She was one of those treasures, and she just really loved Jesus. She was just joyful and mature. And so this guy said, oh, yeah, I know her. She's got a great character, but, I'm just not physically attracted to her at all. And she wasn't a drop-dead, gorgeous woman, I guess you would say. In his eyes, anyway, he didn't think so. And so Brady just challenged him, you should just get to know her character, and just spend some time with her and see what you think. Well, he accepted the challenge, and he did. He started to get to know her, and they became friends, and he got to the point where he came back and told Brady that when he first got to know her, he didn't consider her beautiful, but when he did find out who her character was, and Jesus, she was one of the kind of those people that Jesus just shined through her and her joy, and when he was a part of that for a good period of time, he came back and he truly could say that his visual towards her had completely changed. She became the most beautiful woman to him, and they got married. It was just this beautiful story. A sad story that ended up in that about 3 months after they got married, she got very badly burned by hot grease in an accident, and was
all down the side of her face, down this arm, and all down this breast.
So
deeply scarred.
Yeah. So they went through significant challenges in their marriage, but she just was they faced it with just such perseverance and maturity, and that wasn't the end of their struggles. That she ended up dying from brain cancer later, and he had kidney failure, and they just of a couple that had faced so many things in their marriage, but they were true to each other through it all, and just were a really great example of their love and commitment to their vows.
His name was Steve, and I asked him once because her name was Juanita, and she lived after they came from the hospital. They lived with us for a while, so we could help in her care, her daily care. And I asked him quite some time later on. I says, "How are you coming to terms with the woman that walked down the aisle that you looked at is not the woman you now walk into a room every day with?" And he said, and this was not shuck and jive, Jesus blither. He said, "God has given me such a deep honor for her that I'm aware of the scarring, but I just look in her eyes, and nothing's changed at that moment. And I have such a love to be in the better and worser of her life." And I thought, Jesus, make me like this young man. Yeah. So those are some thoughts on it, The other thing is, I think when we marry people and we're really conscious that the other person's marrying because, I look so great, then you live in fear that I got to maintain it. But when somebody can really look at you and say, "I find you attractive," but what is most attractive to me and Shirley is her genuine love for Christ. And I also think I'm glad she's not drop dead beautiful because I want to keep breathing. You know.
Nicholas Sparks can eat his heart out. I'm just kidding. Okay. Okay. Cool. Okay, I have a pretty cynical view of marriage. My parents had a boring, unhappy marriage that ended in divorce. A lot of Christians tell me that marriage is hard. Can I have a fun, vibrant, God-centered marriage? Not marriages. Can I have a fun, vibrant, God-centered marriage? Do fun marriages exist?
You described my parents' relationship, except they never divorced. And it scared me a lot. And so I was very cynical about marriage, and the thought of making a lifelong commitment was horribly scary for me. I actually went to a good counselor friend after I dated Shirley for some time, and she finally figured out this boy either needs to figure it out and say yes or no or move on, because she was going to move on. And in talking with him, I discovered that the thing I feared most was the permanency of the pledge, that there wasn't a back door to it. And that what was wrestling that fear in me was that the model I'd primarily seen, the most vivid emotional model in my life, was my parents. And he helped me to look at some of the other people that I knew, a couple named Sherman Laurie and other couples that were older by a good 10, 15 years and had very enriching marriages. And I knew them well enough that I knew the richness of their marriage was a combination that they could really enjoy aspects of life together, and that they could also go through difficult times and come out on the other end better, improved by it. And so I would say Shirley and I have a generally quite joyful marriage. We really enjoyed each other even when we had adolescents in the house. While they were being temporarily demon-possessed, we still found joy with each other. And but there were hard times. And those hard times of external pressure created hard times for us as well. So I think if your projection is I'm going to find some kind of utopian happiness, and you really have to ask yourself, because no, I know that's not. But you really have to ask yourself, what do I think happiness is about? What do I think causes it? And so I find sometimes that I find real joy in just being present to Shirley when we're in real pain. You know? Is there room for that kind of joy and happiness? Then I think, yes, you can. You're not doomed by your parents' personalities, character, and choices, unless you copy them. And then you'll be like them. But if you really say, no, I'm going to frame my life in obedience to a different kind of vision and virtue that I see in God, and I'm going to be a God chaser and follow after his way, then you will build a better, different kind of marriage. You're not doomed. You can have a good, joyful marriage with the better and the worsers of real life in it.
Yes, I agree. I think you can have a vibrant, fun, and exciting marriage, but you got to decide you want that. And it's going to take, it takes work, but every good thing in life takes work. You have to be willing to work at it. I mean, if you get lazy, Brady and found in our marriage, sometimes we both, or one of us might get lazy at it when you just kind of, I don't want to do that, and usually we're selfish, and in marriage, I found out when I married Brady, I didn't realize how incredibly selfish I was until we were relating to each other in that way. But when we decide that, no, we're not going to get lazy, we're going to work through things, we're going to keep talking, we're going to go out and have fun, we're going to have dates together, we're just going to enjoy simple things in life together. I mean, he's my best friend, apart from Jesus. He's just my best friend, and that's how our relationship started. That was the foundation of it, and it's never changed. I wouldn't, if I think of anybody I'd want to do something with, it's going to be him, and I want to keep it that way. But we have to keep relating to each other and caring, and it's selfless loving. A lot of times, it's making those decisions to be selfless in our love. But I think, sadly, I can understand that question in that we know a lot of marriages in the church that are sad. They're just sad and they're broken. And the Christian community, sadly, is not a good example to the world. And I can see why young people are looking at some of the marriages, a lot of them, that they're like, I don't want to be like that. But you don't have to be. Find some good, strong couples in your church, and in your lives, and go to them and talk to them and find out how they're, staying together and how their marriages are fun and vibrant. And you can learn from them. Let them be your models and not the negative examples.
In counseling, we can tell probably after about an hour talking to a troubled marriage and pinpoint and share, this is why. What we find out is it's not ignorance. It's not even complicated most times. It's the unwillingness to serve the other person's interest and joy. And so in our life, from the bedroom scene all the way to going shopping for, groceries at Costco, which is just like for me, oh, God, deliver me. And so Shirley will perkily say, you want to go shopping with me? And so I go, yeah. And she says, no, do you really want to go? Or are you just doing this for me? And I said, of course I'm doing it for you. But that's part of what it means to love. And so when I'm exhausted, I'd rather sit in my room with a book, and Shirley says, let's go hike Mount Baker. Okay, we'll go hike Mount Baker, honey, because there's a joy that comes in seeing joy in the other person. And if you don't have that kind of commitment, you won't be a very happy person ever. You won't even like yourself after a while. Okay?
In general, how much time should be spent with a significant other, and at what times of day, without it becoming inappropriate?
You're talking about dating.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
My adage is nothing good happens after 10 o'clock. You don't study very well, you don't watch things very well, and you don't conduct yourself morally very well. Tired people are vulnerable people. And so I think you should date in the daylight, so to speak, that you should date in public places, that you should not turn your dorm room into your hospitality center, that you should date sitting up or standing up with your clothes on and in very public places. People don't do really, Christian people do not do, dark, deep, sinful acts in public venues. Okay? I think you should not relate so much that you begin to neglect your same-sex relationships, your small groups, your studies, etc. You should live a measured life. We know couples that they'll say, oh, we just don't have any time together. And so we'll say, well, how much time do you have together? Well, we got all day Saturday, and we got all day Sunday, and we have date night on Tuesday, and we're in a small group together on Thursday. And after Shirley and I talk to these couples, we look at each other and say, when was the last time that we had even anywhere near that amount of time just alone? Once you have kids, you don't have a lot of alone time, And so I think you have a measured life, but infatuation makes you want to spend every minute together. And so you have to learn to measure it out because it allows infatuation to be tempered down, and you begin to find out how to serve each other. And if somebody says, I need you with me all the time, it's very inspiring, but it probably means you got a pretty needy person. And so I think you kind of work it out in a way that's helpful to the growth of your relationship, and that you do those things in places that serve both your strengths and protect you from your weaknesses. Anything to add? Shirley says I answered that.
Okay, good deal. When I think about dating, I think it has to be a little selfish because you're trying to find someone you could love and marry, etc. Is that true? What is the balance between being selfless and serving someone and figuring out what traits are traits that you're looking for in a marriage?
That's a great question.
I thought so too.
You want to go first? Oh, thanks. Well, if it was completely selfless, then I'd marry somebody with the greatest need. The person I see probably has the greatest need usually is a widowed, elderly woman without a good pension. Okay, that didn't seem to ring any, sign me up. I think you're right. I don't know that I want to use the word selfish. I would say we marry someone whom we mutually admired, and so there is a mutual admiration society in friendship. I wanted to marry someone who really could be a deep spiritual friend. And so we discovered that we admire the same virtues. But even though we admire the same virtues, as Shirley said, there are places still in everyday life where we simply serve the interest of the other more highly than ourselves, that we think of the other more highly than ourselves. And again, this happens in places that when I was young could never imagine, the bedroom. There are times that you just, you're in the mood and they're not, and you got to navigate which interest rules. Do I serve the interest of the one that's in the mood, or do I serve the interest of the one who's exhausted? And so there's always negotiation in that sense. But I don't see the fact that you would like to get married. I see that as both a creational and a biological kind of drive in us. And I don't think any more than that it's selfish to eat appropriately. How selfish of you, you're eating. I think what's selfish is to be a glutton. How selfish of you that you have a sex drive. What's selfish is to use it inappropriately. How selfish it is of you to want, a friend that you could walk with life, hopefully for a long time. And I don't think that's selfish. I think that's built into the sociological nature that God created in us. But it can certainly become, and oftentimes does, selfish. So you have to figure that part out, I think, more than anything.
A lot of times we have lists as single people of all the qualities or all, the looks or all that of what we're looking for. But I wonder how often we have lists of what I can be to that other person, I don't think we do very often, but I think that's an important thing to ask. Like, what do you have to bring into this relationship? How are you going to relate in a way that's going to serve somebody? So I think that might be a good thing to add to have another list going.
Yeah, it's really good. When you interview, a good interview will ask you, what do you bring to make this company better? Whoa. And they'll know if you're shucking and jiving them. What do you bring to make our life a greater impact for God and His kingdom and for our life and health to the table? What do you bring? That's great, We should get a list like that. What did I bring?
How do you date without possibly ruining a friendship if it doesn't work out?
By both people knowing that dating is a social relationship without a commitment. And that you don't project your dreams, your wishes, and your Disney fantasies onto the other person because they were nice enough to say, hi, would you like to go and have some spaghetti? And you're thinking, whoa, he likes spaghetti. And you're starting to plan your wedding. Well, you already planned it. You already planned it. You don't need to plan it. You're just waiting for him to come and get on the tux, or vice versa. But it's generally the other way. You have to understand that there's risk in dating, that affections can grow and that they might not grow equally. That's why you have that famous DTR. Now, it's weird to have a DTR on the first social outing. That's just, okay, we got to define the relationship. What relationship? We're eating spaghetti. I got to know you. You're a Corfa, and and I thought you were fun, and I just wanted to get to know you a little better. Now, if you want to tamp some of that down, the guys gave really good wisdom. We call it when we were hippies and just got saved and stuff, and we didn't trust ourselves very much, and we weren't quite sure about where dating came anyway, because it wasn't in the Bible. If it wasn't in the Bible, you probably shouldn't do it, So we would go out and herd dates. 3 or 4 guys who were buddies would ask 3 or 4 gals that we enjoyed being around, and we'd all go out. Everybody paid their own, and we went and did things together the different ones of the group enjoyed. You got to know each other casually that way, so by the time we actually did start to think about dating somebody, we at least knew there was some basis of mutual, admiration and value there and stuff. So I think there are things you can do, but I think you have to tell yourself, especially when you start to get infatuated. This is my profound counsel to our students. When you're infatuated early on, and I think early on is months of dating, a number of months of dating, just stick your head under a pillow and scream and laugh. But for God's sake, quite literally, don't act on it. Men, do not overstate your attraction to them. You're the greatest thing since, the Mother Mary. You're the most virtuous woman in all of the fellowship. You're a queen of Israel. You're my bright and morning star. Shut up, men. Even though women want you to communicate, shut up. Don't over-talk it, don't touch it, and whatever you do, don't swap spit about it. Because you don't know what that means to the other person. And personally, I think, don't pay for them. Not a single woman said amen.
Like ever?
Like,
never, ever?
No, I pay for everything now. Jesus provides it, but I pay up for all of our dates. But when Shirley and I first went out, we didn't go any place that was just exotic or expensive or anything. And I can't remember us figuring out who paid.
We didn't have a real dating relationship.
What do you mean? We would go to Costco and things like that with the kids. Oh, that's true. We got the free samples, didn't we? You have to understand, both of us are Dutch, and I'm also Scottish, so, using money is probably sinful, So all I'm saying is, the thing that Brandon said about the guy that went on the carriage ride and stuff, there are ways you communicate, wow, and there are ways you communicate, hi, sis, hi, bro. And you want to do that for quite a while, no matter what's going on in your head and your heart. Stick your head under the pillow and scream. And don't tell your girlfriends or the guys because they'll put it on Facebook and everybody know what you think and feel. Just tell Jesus. He's very trustworthy. He knows how to keep a secret.
Well, when you're dating quite a bit, there's always the potential of woundedness, especially if one's more interested in the other. But one thing that's really going to wreck a good friendship is, like Brady mentioned, is the physical part. So we always tell our students, don't engage in physical anything. If it doesn't work out, you don't have to go through that awkward thing of they're in your ministry and you see them and you've done things with them that you are embarrassed about. And they're your brother and sister first. I loved what you guys said this morning, by the way. It was excellent. You shared so much great wisdom advice. So thank you. But what was I saying?
That they did a great job.
No, before that.
Physical.
Yeah, physical. So it's just like you're in ministry together and you're facing each other all the time. And do you want to really look at someone that way and know things about them that you shouldn't know because you have crossed the boundaries? That's going to make it really difficult to be a friend. So value your friendship as brothers and sisters, like they said this morning, higher than that, so that you don't have that awkward part. And you can, because a lot of times it doesn't work out. and then you can still have friendship with each other.
And this thing of working out, I think, is important. That the Scripture gives you the freedom to remain single or to marry within the Lord, right? 1 Corinthians 7. Go work yourself through that if you haven't before. So you have this freedom. Now, it's a gracious God-given freedom that says we should be mature and that we have certain freedom with our Abba Father. But it's also a burden because then you have to manage it properly, right? And so when we talk about ruining a good friendship, I think a good friendship, we need to also define that just like we define what it means to really love one another in the marital context. I love Alreda Ravo's definition of a spirit-led and controlled friendship. He says, in that friendship, we promote the divine good in the other person. And so if you're in a relationship and one of the people have discovered for whatever reason that they don't sense that this is a wise thing to pursue further, there's a graciousness that has to say, this says something about them. And I should affirm their hesitancy as much as it's a disappointment for me. And I think there's just that kind of grace and generosity of spirit that's needed to have it not, really mess it up. Now, by messing up, I'm assuming you mean that it fractures it, as opposed that it's going to be awkward maybe, and you're going to have to let your feelings down, and so you don't try to retain an intense friendship after you've said, I can't go that road. Okay, let's have some time of space. Communicate well there, Communicate, but can we still stay friends and hang out every day together? Let's be wise about how emotions grow and how they can be brought back to a different station of experience. So no, I really, really treasure our friendship. No, we can't meet every day until we've given a good period of time that it can come to a place where you're at peace with our friendship. Okay? And so, but you got to talk about that because otherwise a person goes, what's wrong with me? What did I do? What did I say? Et cetera, And so communication's important, space is important, but really promote the divine good. And if the other person doesn't have the freedom for whatever reason, oh my goodness, I'm not mature enough, I've discovered, then give them space. Pressuring somebody to stay in a relationship that they don't have the wherewithal to stay in is to invite disaster. Okay? It invites trouble later. So, there's a few thoughts.
Okay, these are two questions, but I'm going to ask them both because they're kind of similar, sort of. In a relationship, is it healthy to reestablish boundaries, and if so, how often? And another question is, at what point should you determine your boundaries with your person of interest?
Those are great questions.
I'll just start.
Yeah. When you're willing to go first, you just got to hit me so I know that,
We talked to our girls.
That's where I was going.
You were, oh.
How do you know?
We talked to our girls
We know each other so well.
when they were probably 13, 14, 12, somewhere in there, about boundaries. Because so many times we wait until you're interested in somebody, and then you decide, I like this person, we need to establish boundaries. It's way too late because, like Brady said, your emotions are all up and you're infatuated, and your boundaries are probably going to be a little bit different than when you're younger. So we had our girls write down, go through scripture and stuff and write down boundaries before they were even allowed to date, way before that. And it's just a fun family thing that we did with them, and just wanting them to start thinking about, what does God say about this? Where should we be? What is the world saying about this? And where do I want to be on this? Who am I going to listen to, the world or Jesus on this? So that's where I would start. Let me think here. What we're always asking, I think, is how far can I go? We're always asking that question, how far can I go? Where I think a better question to ask is, how far could I stay away from that? So I don't really know about should you change your boundaries? I think it's so easy to cross the boundaries. As you grow closer in a relationship, we always want to fudge with the boundaries because, it's fun to kiss and to do that stuff. It's really fun. And it's easy to do that. It's a lot harder to go out on a date and learn how to communicate than it is to do physical stuff. And so we're always tempted, though, to go with the easy route. And so I don't really think changing them as you get closer is maybe a good idea.
Yeah, I think it's good. A side story. Our younger daughter, when we did this, whatever age they were, she didn't put anything about, touching or kissing on her boundary list, which I thought was kind of the part of the deal. So I asked her, I said, Stacy, you didn't say anything about kissing. And she says, oh, yuck. We realized she was too young to set boundaries. She still thought boys had really bad germs and she didn't want to get them. Okay? I think it's all of you are at an age where you could take out a covenantal relationship with God. And that's who I think. It should be first with the Lord. Lord, I covenant that this is how I'm going to conduct myself with your daughter or your son. I think, if we were in the back seat on a date with you, you would all have very, very, very good boundaries. Right? The Holy Spirit is present in and with you. And your Abba loves you as his child. And we are warned in Corinthians, that text about that you're the temple, that woe to the one who desecrates the temple of another. Okay? So there's profound moral obligation in my self-control, which is a virtue of the Spirit, a fruit of the Spirit. So I think it's really good, whether you have anybody in mind at all, to say, God, how would you want me to act and why? So that when you sit down with somebody in the friendship and the kind of just socializing is moving into, will you accept my pursuit of you to see if the outcome could be a permanent outcome? I don't think you have to try to think through then what your boundaries are. They're already established in the easiest realm, and that's before the emotions kick. This is how I am going to conduct myself. We do this with our students, and the ones that are willing to do it find it very, very enriching, and we really push it. We say you need to list what you won't do, but you also need to list what you will do because of all that extra time you're going to have on your hands, because of what you won't do, and where you'll be, where you'll go, and where you won't go. And so it teaches them, and then this covenant they've made with God, they make to one another, which is a preamble for this covenant till death do us part. So it teaches how to make and keep promises. And we found that the couples, find it very, very enriching to do this. It's also maddening at times, and especially if you go and watch a Disney movie where the frogs are singing and the birds are playing and you're rowing out in the thing and they're singing, you just got to kiss the girl, and you're standing at the porch and you want to kiss the girl, but nope, I have, until I can make the commitment and it can be fulfilled in covenant, there's certain things I will not do. Other thing, I think it's really important to explain your boundaries. We tell this story, if you get the thing on our Pizza Theology ever, of a couple that had both been very sexually adventurous in their pagan days, and they both had come to Christ, and they eventually met each other and pursued, and the guy said to the gal right off, I'm not going to kiss you. And he said, but now listen to me. It's not because you're unattracted to me. It's because you are attractive to me. And I am vulnerable in this arena. And I have hurt other human beings. And I have too much respect for you to hurt you. And the gal said, I'm on board with that. Thank you for letting me know that so I won't be insecure in some weird way. And I'm also on board with your commitment because I've got a past that makes me vulnerable too. And they dated for a long time. And the day they got married was the first day, and I'm not saying this is everybody's rule or anything, although I think it's brilliant. When I said, you may now kiss the bride, they did. They sealed their covenant with a kiss. And that's, I think, supposed to be romantic, isn't it? It's a lot better than just I make out with everybody I know,
Totally okay. Totally okay. Okay. So I have a few. I don't have a few. These aren't all mine. About sex.
Now,
They're all mine.
we're almost through her questions now, and we'll be getting to some of yours.
Okay. So these are all sort of related. These are like the bulk of the sex questions. So I'm going to fire them all at you because they're all kind of related. So I'll tell you when it's your turn. Okay. So first, you kind of answered this sort of just now, but what is a godly view of making out? But hold on, don't. That is someone's question. They could be in here crying now. I'm just kidding. Okay. And then these questions are kind of similar, just asking about like physical compatibility and sexual compatibility, because there's this idea in our society of you need to be sexually compatible. So how can you know that before you've gotten married if you don't have sex first? And then another person was asking what is sex like for two people who are really pursuing God, and then they get married and have sex. And then this lines up. Just what is sex like for disciples is what they were asking. So, like, can you describe it in great detail? I'm just kidding.
I love that. You can just see it. The first church of the sexual disciples. You know, I bet you get lots of single people coming.
They just put like, what is sex like? - with disciples. Okay. And then this person asked, within the covenant of marriage, is anything other than vaginal sex, okay? And that's it. That's
Shirley will want to answer that one.
So making out, sex before marriage, about like sexual chemistry and compatibility. What is sex like? Basically,
let's go one at a time. The theology of making out. You know, God.
He did say earlier you could ask any question.
I did.
Who's going to answer them?
Whatever happened to marital submission?
That's a question too.
Yeah, that's a question coming up. Great. We'll let Shirley answer that one. You know, sometimes you just don't want to put words in our Abba's mouth that he hasn't spoken. What I think is clear that you're not to defraud anybody. And so the issue is before marriage. Once I said, I covenant with you, Shirley May Bovenkamp, till death do us part, in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, you know, then the one-bodied relationship, the conjoining of our bodies in the pleasure of sex and in procreation and children and all that is part of the covenantal freedom. Before then, my actions, I have to ask, are my actions rather implicitly creating the illusion, the expectation, or the assumption of a devotion and a commitment that's beyond what it actually is? And I think if I am, then I'm defrauding. Okay? So in that sense, you know, mashing and all that stuff, as much as I love to do that with Shirley, I just think it's fun, you know, and pleasurable. That's why it's a challenge for us, right? When we're not married, is that how do I say? Okay, you know, sexual intercourse. We'll use the proper names here so we can dampen down a little bit. Sexual intercourse. The emotional arousing affections of it are very easily triggered, and it can be nothing more than holding hands, as some of you have discovered. But if all I do is hold hands, I'll never get to the bedroom. But if I hold hands, and I move from holding hands to I'm hugging, I'm moving from hugging that I'm giving you a back rub. I'm moving from the back rub that, you know, that I'm whispering in your ear and blowing in your ear and then kissing your ear and then I'm licking your face and then I'm licking your mouth. And, you know, I mean, it's called foreplay. And you got to decide, when am I defrauding this person and consciously leading them to arousal desires? And that's where I think you draw the line. And so I think it gets drawn way back. I think it means that women have to be modest for the sake of their brother if for no other reason. Okay? And you girls know when you look in the mirror before you walk out the door how you look. And you know good and well because you grew up in the culture what men look at. Now, do I think you ought to go around in sackcloth, all the way down to ankles? Do I think we should be wearing burqas? While it'll help men focus on your eyes, we probably don't need to go that far. And men have some responsibility to, in fact, look in your eyes. But we have to ask, when are we defrauding? When are we, by what we say or what we do, defrauding? And so that's why I think making out is just, it leads to conclusions that are understandable why the other person would think that. Wow, I just think as a Christian man, you wouldn't do this with all girls that you go out on dates with. On the other hand, there is also the problem in the Christian community where we think, well, this isn't sex, we're just making out. Sex is only penetration. This isn't that, therefore it's okay. But what it does, it stirs up all the emotions and everything, and it turns sex into not something that has to do with coupling and love as a reinforcement of the character love and other qualities of love, but it has just to do with I'm getting my kicks. I think that's inappropriate. I think there, I could say God would say that's inappropriate. Okay? Because it's not a real sense of I'm meeting this other person's need with a generous heart and I'm in commitment with them so their heart won't be broken later by my conduct. And I think that's the issue I go with there. What's the next question?
Mandy just told me this one, so I was stumbling through it. So if a couple is in a relationship, in a dating relationship, and they've already crossed some serious boundaries or had sex, but they're still dating, what do you think is the proper protocol there?
Okay, and I mean this gently, okay? You have to repent. You have to say, we have made a serious mistake. We are going to separate from that mistake, and we're going to create boundaries that are probably even more careful than what we would have needed had we set them in the beginning. We're going to have to date longer, which is really, it's a tension because you're already into this quasi-pseudo-sexual marriage, and now you're going to have to date longer so that the bonding chemistry of sexual intercourse doesn't confuse you as to the true ability to live wisely and well with each other and to have high regard for each other, etc. And so you've got to really undo some things. You've got to learn the virtue of self-control. You'll need it all through marriage, in not just sexual areas but other areas. And you have to see if you can in fact reclamate the relationship, or whether the woundedness of your sin against one another has scarred the relationship in a way that you just need separation. Okay? And that probably comes best, the guidance and the evaluation, that probably comes best by talking to Ronnie and Tana and people like that. They can help you figure out and then evaluate along the way. Because you know the chemistry of sexuality, that it creates, stronger in women than in men, bonding mechanisms. And those bonding mechanisms confuse the other questions about the virtues and values and communication and bucks, finances and all that. It creates a pseudo connectivity. And that's why you see enormous divorce problems about 3 to 7 months in. The first year and then about 3 years and it's 7 years. And it's because that has to do with different people's ability to sustain a relation together based in sex before kids and everything come and change the shape of the relationship. And so you have to understand you are dealing with a powerful thing here. When you have sexual intercourse, you are co-creating with God potentially. And when a woman gives birth to a child, it creates bonding chemistry with the child. You're dealing with the amazement of your bodies. Women much more aggressive in those chemicals than men, which is why men can walk away and break your hearts after they've lived with your bodies. And so we've got to become wise. And so there has to be separation. There has to be ability to come back to self-control and those things.
I have a great story of a couple that was in our group many years ago who had, we had a time when they did their purity covenant with each other, and they had totally crossed the lines in a big chunk of their relationship, and brought it to us, confessed to us, and what do we do with our relationship now? And so we just counseled them. You've got to just stop doing this. There was shame in their lives. They had lost respect, big time respect for the other. There was anger toward the other because they were blaming each other for the fact they kept falling into sin, sexual sin with each other. So we just asked them to, redo their covenant and draw the lines way back. I mean, I don't think they could barely touch, because just the littlest things, was just because they had given themselves in so many ways to each other. So they decided the relationship was worth it, but it was a lot of hard work. And they had to relearn how to communicate with each other, how to respect each other. They came up with lists of things. How can we tell each other and communicate our esteem for each other and love for each other in ways that are not physical at all? And it was a great exercise for them. They did it, and they stayed pure, and it took a long time. They didn't get married for probably, maybe a year and a half after all that. And so when they, came to the wedding, they were just, there was forgiveness. They had to learn forgiveness towards each other and grace towards each other. There's always forgiveness in Jesus. If you're sitting here now and you just feel like crummy because you have crossed the boundaries, that you've given yourself away to someone, don't live in that horrible guilt and shame. Come to Jesus. I mean, He's going to forgive you. But you also have to come just really persevering and saying, I don't want to live that way. I want to live a new life, and repent and establish new standards for yourself. So we have some great stories of people who have done the hard work and repented and learned new ways to relate. So there's always hope in Jesus.
And I think those that have done that, they haven't all described it, but one couple described it as that God has restored the psychology within us of virginity. They felt, lived, and anticipated much more like a virgin than a person that was known to the other. God had kind of psychologically even begun a deep healing in them. And so we're not without real hope. And I came to Christ at the age of 19, and so I had lots of sick sexual baggage. And God has healed that. We've got a great marriage, okay? And so He does these things. But you've got to work with Him, or nothing good comes from it, right?
So then the other one that kind of relates to that is this idea of sexual chemistry, and if you don't explore that before a marriage,
compatibility.
Yeah,
well, it's one of the great demonic myths. You have to find out if you're sexual compatible. The myth came out of the 60s. God bless all of us boomers who have messed up the world. And the myth came out of university professors who probably were projecting their own problems and their own psyche rather than the actual realities. The number one cause of divorce is not sex. The number two cause of divorce is not sex. The number three cause of divorce is not sex. In fact, sexual dysfunction, that is biological dysfunction, the last I read was about 0.5% of people who even have to go to counseling at all for help. What messes up sex is, people will say it's our bedroom scene because we don't have it. But what killed the bedroom scene were the other scenes. Non-communication, non-respect, et cetera, and financial pressure and all that kind of stuff. See, we think sex is what makes marriage work, but actually what makes sex work is the components that make for a great marriage. And so you've been raised your entire life, now I'm not saying within the church and your families and things like that, but in the culture that says sex is the reason we get married. And now that it's normative acceptable to not be married and have sex, notice people don't even get married. But the divorce rate amongst cohabitating adults that aren't married is higher than the divorce rate amongst married people. So this experiment, let's live together and see if we're sexually compatible. Just trust us. The plumbing works 99.5% of the time. Okay? And when it doesn't work, there's usually things that are reasonably available fixes if you just talk to somebody that can counsel you, etc. Okay? So we have made this tiny little issue massive. And then on top of that, we watch movies, kind of voyeuristic movies. We get out our sofa and we sit and look into our neighbor's window. And that's what it's like watching some of these movies. Like, oh, you'd never do that with your neighbor. Why do you do this here? And what is it like? They always have great sex. They don't even know each other and they have great sex. They're not clumsy. They never fall out of bed. It's never funny. They never go, oops, It's completely unrealistic. And the thing that'll help your virginalized brains come back is quit watching that stuff. If you're married, just look at it and go, oh, right. What a bunch of baloney. But if you're single and kind of, the hormones are working, you go, oh, wow. And so you got to get realistic about that stuff. And you got to make very good, sensible, self-controlled, wise decisions about it. All right? But don't go freaking out. That it's all this propaganda about sex. Cosmopolitan magazine is one of the great offenders. I see a cover when I go by. Women's magazines in general are just terrible. I'm not talking about Betty Crocker, okay? I'm talking about Cosmos, Self, Shape, Me, My. Consistently, Cosmo will have this kind of headline: 50 ways to just rock your lover off of his brains. Great. I mean, one, who's got the time to memorize 50 ways of whatever, and why would I want him to be off his brains? What am I, some kind of performing seal in the bedroom? And that the only way I can keep my guy is if if I'm just racing all the time to find some new way to just shock the heck out of his hormones? Call, girls, that would be exhausting for the guy. Okay, so get real. Get rid of all that junk. Get rid of all those dumb books we're reading. Get rid of all the dumb movies we're watching. If you want to watch a chick flick, girls, get the guy to come watch Little House on the Prairie.
And
Shrek, multiple times, very realistic theater and theology. And Anne of Green Gables, the entire series. The entire series. And if the guy doesn't cry when Grandpa dies, dump him. Okay? Until he can get in touch with his real emotions. Okay? So just enough said.
Okay. And then the last, wait, what time do we have to be out of here? Oh, good. Okay. So then, sorry, are y'all so bored? Are you sick of this?
Bored?
Okay. Well, the last one.
I'm just thinking about asking Shirley if I talk to her for a while afterwards if we can make out when we get to the room. Talking doesn't affect me at all. Is it affecting you?
Let's talk about Anne of Green Gables more. I'm just kidding.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So, and then the last sex ones are about sex within marriage, like what's it like? I guess they asked, and also, is anything other than vaginal sex okay?
Well, the last one is a theoretical question. The first one is an intimate question, which I won't answer.
Okay.
Okay, here's why. We have all these self-disclosure books going out. I mean, you even have Christians saying you ought to just say everything you feel. Why? Shirley and I I'll tell you generalities. We have a good enough sex life to have produced children. We have a good enough sex life that we both find pleasure, excitement, and humor in it. And at times, it is funny. You just go, who thought this up? What was God thinking? But, nevertheless, we have, fill the earth, so it's working. Okay? A couple of things I will say about sex and marriage generally. It is a servant relationship when it's good as opposed to a taking. And so I do measure to some degree my masculine macho-ness by her satisfaction. Okay? We do have boundaries. There are things that are, in our mind, demeaning, even if they would be stimulating. I mean, smoking dope is stimulating. Taking heroin is stimulating. Lots of things stimulate, but they're not, just because they stimulate doesn't mean they're wholesome. We don't do bondage because we don't think anybody should be imprisoned, enslaved by sexuality. And so the bondage club at Western, I think, is a deep distortion of the human nature of our beings and our sexuality. And I don't care how long they try to tell me this is normative and it's so exciting and everything. Well, it's exciting in a twisted way. And so we don't do fantasy stuff. We do real relationship stuff. I think our general rule has been what creates a sense of shame or a memory of regret that is not discussed generally in Scripture, we would talk about those kinds of things. And again, we're not looking for 50 ways to, just rocket the other person. It makes sex as if it's removed from emotional caring. We think sex is oftentimes a gentle giving of ourselves in recovening, body recovening, and also a release of sexual desiring. And in our marriage, there's been times where I've had the stronger drive, and there's been times where she has. And sometimes we've had it at the same time. That really makes it easy. Okay? We don't do anything that we perceive to be degrading, and we ask each other, is this uncomfortable to you? Okay? We had none of those conversations before we were married. And in premarital counseling, nobody asked us to go through the details of our anticipated sex life. Okay? People might debate the goodness or badness of that. For us, it was really good because we're really adherents of Dobson's little one-liner. He said, great sex begins in the kitchen. Now, my background would say, that sounds kinky. But what he meant was it's the way you live most of the day that makes sexuality enriching. And when I live most of the day in generous and care and careful not to hurt her feelings or her identity, not to stir harm in her, and vice versa, it would be strange then to turn the bedroom scene into some kind of, a circus and trampoline of sexuality. And so I think you gently explore what's appropriate and what would be degrading to you. Now, you do have to be careful because if you come out of a degraded background where you've been abused or something, even those things that are most fundamental to sexual conjoining can be shame-producing. And so, that's where we really do need to work through some things so that we can enter into that relationship with that person, trusting them, trusting one another, and then moving forward in the exploring of what it means to be sexually intimate to one another. I think that's what I would say. That was enough.
Okay, what is the best way to work through abusive past hang-ups before entering a relationship?
Well, I don't know if there's a best way. I think there are some helpful, reading a good book thoughtfully is like going to a good counselor. And there are some helpful books out there. and they don't cost $150 an hour. Depending on the level of the abuse and how it's playing out in you or I, who was the abuser, what was the nature of the depth of it, the repetition of it, etc. Then I think that there's a point where it's wise to ask a pastor, of your own sex or a spouse of a pastor, here's my story. I've read this stuff. Is there somebody you think I could talk to that's really laser beamed on that area? And what are restorative mechanisms that help? Because outside of sex, let me tell you a story that illustrates the challenge I think we face. And I experienced abuse, not from my mom, not from my dad, type of thing, and it wasn't, constant or anything like that. But I experienced sexual abuse as a child. Okay? And it affected my perceptions of sex. It distorted them. So different people, your process, how you come to terms with that is important. But when I married Shirley, there had been a good period of time from the time that she'd been abandoned in her marriage, and she'd been a single woman, and she really felt like she'd worked it through quite deeply. She was very engaged with society, with the church, and with her kids. And when we got married, it brought back memories. As long as she wasn't engaging with a man that way, those memories felt like they had been dealt with. But even though she knew it wasn't the guy that had betrayed her, the emotional tape came back. And fortunately, God had kind of warned us about that, and we had prayed that He'd really reveal to us when it was an issue between us versus when it was an issue between our past. But had come in, the relationship between us had re-triggered the tape being played. And so I think sometimes counseling can be very, very helpful. Okay? And it's worth investing in the relationship and working it through. But there is a time we ask our couples right at the end if there's anything they feel the other person should know about their past without being overly detailed or graphic. And it surprises us sometimes that there are things that people have hidden because of deep shame. They've repented. They want to forget it, But one couple, the gal said, I know that you were raised Catholic. I know that your life and your experiences included that, but broadened from that. But I think because I know the depth of your upbringing and your value, you need. She said, you need to know that before I knew Jesus, I got pregnant and I was so scared and so self-centered that I had an abortion. And she says, I understand completely you cannot marry me. And I've got to tell you this because I got to know you can marry me in spite of. There's a place for that, but it's at the very end where you're quite convinced through pre-engagement that this really is going to go to engagement, And it wasn't detailed. She didn't say who the dad, none of that. She just said, this is the bottom line, and you have a right to know this. So in our courtship before, and so we encourage them to wait a period and to try and to work that, to converse that through. And so there is a time to tell, but it's hard to know, should that come sooner or later? I don't know the answer to that. Because it will come back up emotionally to some degree or other. And the person needs to know, I needed to know that there had been real harm in her. And then we really needed to know that Jesus would give us wisdom. So I could say, is this me or is this Him? Okay? So I think, I don't know if I answered the question, but I tried. You want to add?
Great. Okay, so this one is about dating non-Christians. Just basically, what does that look like? What can that look like? Is what this person is asking. They said, what should it look like if they don't pull you directly away from God and they respect you and your beliefs as a Christian?
There is a command. The 1 Corinthians 7 says you can marry or choose to remain single. There and in 1 Timothy says, but if you do marry someone in the Lord. And the reason is not that God doesn't love people who don't yet know Him. It's that Proverbs wisdom. How can two walk together and arrive at the same place if they don't have the same path? Or the way Paul puts it, and he doesn't mean, in this a particular nature of evil or goodness. He says, how can light and darkness coexist in harmony? The answer is it can't. How can two radically different claims to allegiance, the radical claim of Jesus in my worldview to all that I am and all that I'll ever be, to God be the glory, and her, not Shirley, but maybe this non-Christian girl who's delightful and intelligent and just a lot of fun and, doesn't she'd rather read a book than climb a mountain, hallelujah, and she loves movies, etc. We're so compatible, and you can fall deeply in love with a person that doesn't know Jesus. Well, you can grow deeply in love. Yeah, they're real humans. Did you know that? Do you remember that you were a real human before you met Jesus? And you're still a real human now? And so we're naive if we think that, well, a non-believer, because they don't know Jesus, just I'd never build attraction. Not true. You can begin to bond emotionally, psychologically, and just your wish dreams can play into it. All right? But I think it's this one area, that God says that, if you're a widow, you can remarry. But marry in the Lord, If you're single, you can marry, but marry in the Lord. And it's the assumption of psychological wholeness. One body, one flesh just isn't your bodies in vaginal sex coming together. It's the whole you finding compatibility together in ultimate goals, ultimate vision. Okay? You cannot do that with a non-believer. You cannot ask them to do what takes the grace and the presence of God's power, rebirthing, and love in their heart for them to be won over so that they obey Him and find regeneration and virtue from Him. They can't be that without that experience and growth in it. And so what we've seen with, consistently, I wouldn't say without exception, I've seen miracles where the person really does come to faith and it worked out. Most of the time what we've seen is the diminishment of commitment to Jesus in order to keep harmony with this other worldview. Or we've seen people coming to church alone because the mate won't. It's not God's will for your life. It diminishes one of the purposes of marriage, which is to God be the glory. A model of Christ to the church. Okay? And so, it's in the kindness of God, it's about the only prohibition in terms of who we marry that there is. You're free to marry. Do it wisely. But don't marry the non-believer. Now, what about dating then? And Shirley just said, and don't date therefore.
I think it's really one of those non-negotiables. It's very dangerous to even, if you've determined your mind, I'm not going to disobey the Lord's command not to marry a non-Christian, then why even date them? We want to kind of play with it, especially if we get attracted to them, but there's no purpose in it, because what's happened, we've seen so many students, they do get involved, and the guy isn't a believer, and he knows the girl is a strong believer, But then if she just makes a decision at the end, I can't marry you because you're not a believer, what does that do to him? He feels, bad. It's just not a good testimony to Christ and a relationship to Christ. And so you're just playing with fire, I think, if you cross that. I see it as a compromise. And we've seen students go there and like there may be an exceptional miracle here and there where it has worked, but generally it has just been a disaster. And we've seen committed people turn away from Jesus because of it, and that's really sad.
In this true story, had a guy come in to call my office. He says, "I hear you're the leader of Campus Christian Fellowship." And I said, "Yeah." And he says, "Well, can I get together with you?" I said, "Well, sure. Who are you?" He said, "Well, I'm da-da-da, and I'm a Western student, and I'd like to talk to you about something." And so he came in and he sat down. I said, "Well, what would you like to talk about?" I said, "Well," he says, "you need to know I am incredibly angry at CCF." I said, "Well, CCF's an organization. How do you be angry at an organization?" And I says, "So who are you angry at?" And he says, my ex-girlfriend. And I knew nothing about him, okay? And I says, "Well, why are you angry at your ex-girlfriend?" He says, "Well, I pursued her, and she allowed it, and we dated a long time, and she knew I was growing to love her deeply. I talked about my dreams and our future, and she went along with it, and we got all the way to just before I was going to ask her to marry me, and she said to me before I did, 'By the way, you need to know, until you become a Christian, I can't marry you.'" And I said, "So what do you want to talk about?" He said, "Two things. I want to know why God thinks so little of me." And I started crying. There's a text in the Old Testament that says about Israel, "Israel, because of you, the nations blaspheme me." This guy had a picture of his pursuing Abba Father. That God the Father didn't think he was good enough for his daughter. And he says, "And I'm really mad at her because I feel she deceived me." And I think he was right. I think she defrauded him. I think she defrauded him on the essentials of honesty and love and integrity because she knew God's command. And she didn't tell him until he was so involved. He was a rather unique guy. He says, "I can't in good conscience commit myself to Christ yet." And he says, "And then how will I ever know whether I did it in order to get her or because I really wanted God?" So this is a complicated, it's not a complicated command, and it's not a complicated obedience, but when we don't obey, it creates all kinds of complications morally. And so you have to love God enough to say, "God, I'm going to reach out to people. If I happen to meet a guy at work and we build a working relationship and he's kind of interested in me and my faith, I'm going to do things and introduce him to guys. I'm going to build bridges. I'm going to be a sister. I'm going to be platonic. I'm not going to play the dating game. There are all kinds of ways you can win him. But really what happened in this girl's life, because I talked to her later and she really was quite repentant when she realized the implications. She said, I've so much wanted to get married that it was an idol that I didn't even know I had. That I was willing to disobey God to get this thing I wanted." And she confessed to him and asked his forgiveness. And they didn't date after that. And I don't know what happened to him. But she sure made it harder for him to know the Abba. And we don't want to do that, do we? We want to make an eternal question much more important than a temporal fulfillment if we know the love of Christ.
If marriage is not in God's will, how does one know that it is something God will allow us to partake in? I think what this person is asking, like, how do I know that it's God's will for me to be married? Basically, if it's not a command, how do we know we even should, if it's beneficial to be single or married?
Well, one, it is God's permissive will that you are free to get married. I met a girl, and I thought I was going to marry her. We dated for quite some time, and I thought I was going to marry her. And so when I asked her, I should have been really up for this ahead of time, but, I was pretty stupid. I didn't read the tea leaves very well. She said no, which was really confusing me because I had prayed to God and said, God, is it your will that I marry this person? And my emotions and everything in me said, yes, it's okay for you to ask her. So I asked her. What the Lord forgot to tell me, or I couldn't hear because of all my emotional fixations, was, oh, and by the way, she's asked me about it, and I told her it's okay if she says no. Okay? This is not a divine requirement. You get that? It's a freedom. And Paul's emphasis is to the men in Corinth, don't be messing with the minds of girls. If you're going to marry them, you're betrothed, if you're going to marry them, then you're free to marry. If you believe spiritually or for whatever reason you shouldn't, then don't keep pursuing it. But make your yes, yes, and your no, no, and walk it straight. So I think it's good to ask the Lord ahead of time and along the way, Lord, do you want me to pursue a single life at this time? And maybe even ask other, older counselors, you know me a bit. Do you think I should have a time of singleness? A celibacy is assumed, right? Non-sexual singleness. Do you think there should be a time of singleness in my life? Now, if I would have asked older brothers about that when I came to faith, anybody had any sense at all would have said, yes, Brady, you need to unravel all kinds of past stuff in the last 4 years of your activities. Okay? And that would have been I wouldn't have liked it, but if I could have embraced it, it would have been very helpful to me, and a whole lot of girls wouldn't have got hurt, and I wouldn't have got hurt by a whole lot of other girls. Okay? So I do think you ask, Lord, do you have for me the desire, do you hold the desire that I should be single? Some of you, the great majority of you will marry, according, at least statistically, and you hate to be the statistic and, great, I'm the 1%, But the fact is, some of you will marry, you'll be married for a short time, you'll be widowed, some of you won't ever marry. And that's where you've got to really get a hold of the fact that while you're free to, circumstances might not bring about the opportunity. Doesn't say anything negatively about you. And then you've got to find the way to be God's whole person because of Christ. And if you're married, I got to figure out how to be God's whole person in spite of the fact that I'm married, because Shirley can't make me whole. Okay? And while my sexual drive can be handled in a different way and easier in many ways, that's part of the challenge of singleness, is you have to learn to be very strong in some areas that you have good outlets for otherwise, okay? But I had to raise children, and you don't. Okay? So I had other things to handle you haven't handled. And so we got to support each other and all. And as we date or as we watch them, we should say, Lord, is this wise to move forward? And you should get good counsel and stuff. But the fact is, I don't know if you should marry or not. God gives you the freedom to. With Jesus, he said, for the sake of the kingdom, some are single. Didn't make it a command. He just observed it. Said some are single because of men. They were eunuchs. Because of the emperors and stuff. Jesus was single for the sake of the kingdom. If you stay single, you're very much like your Lord. Very much like him. And so That's how I'd answer it. Anything, Dan?
Okay, this is a more practical dating question. Is it okay to ever meet up one-on-one with a person of the opposite sex and it not be a date?
Yeah, I get a real kick out of the fact, the utter fear of the word dating. You know, I mean, there's books that, I think you're alluding to it. You know, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. I read it, and I'm going to write a book someday. I Kissed Kissing Goodbye. Because dating hasn't seemed to be the problem. Kissing seems to be the problem. Okay? What is a date? A date is I call you up. Okay, so I come to Texas. I'm on a committee, and I call Brandon and Casey up, and I go, hey, you guys, I'm coming to Texas. I'm going to be here for a few days. I can fly in early. I land at 12:30. You want to catch some time? Will you pick me up, and we'll catch some time together? I set a date. I'm straight. And I wouldn't date two men at the same time if I wasn't.
Yeah, that's so true.
And we met. Okay? So you got to figure out, what does dating mean in your head? It means in my head, we have agreed to a time and a place to socialize. And as long as that's what it means, as opposed to we've agreed to a time and a place because I want to marry you, that's not a date. That's scary. Okay? And so you got to figure out what it is. So, you could be walking across your campus square and all of a sudden, Sister Sally meets Brother Sam. And you go, where are you headed? I've got a break now. I was headed for the library. Oh, I'm on break too. You want to go have a cup of coffee? Sure. You going to put on change of relationship status on Facebook? I mean, come on, you guys. It would just be good if we had a good belly laugh about all this and just bring it down 1,000. My goodness, you're uptight, But I think we've made you that way, probably, our generation. So I think, just go have fun, will you? And just don't hold hands, don't swap spit, don't touch bodies. Don't talk about, I've always wanted an outdoor wedding. Okay? Guys, just don't admit that to her. Okay? On the second time, don't go out casually once and then call her the next day. And then this was me. I call her that, then I call her up and I'd say, well, we didn't have text. You had to actually talk. Hi, I just want you to know what a great time I had. I'm plying. I'm adding grease to the skids, because I'm infatuated. I was already attracted to her. Something in the way she moved, And then the next day I call her up. Hi, hey, what are you doing tonight? She goes, I got a class. Oh, bummer. I was thinking about catching a movie. Well, I'll call you again tomorrow. I didn't say that, but it'd be tomorrow. If I would have had emails, I would have been accused of being a stalker. Chill out, guys. When you do initiate, just spread it out a little bit. Keep her confused. Keep her guessing. Make her think a date is a social engagement of friendship between a sis and a bro. Okay? Here's the text for you, because some of you are saying, where's the Bible? Where's the Bible? Okay, here's the Bible. 1 Timothy. Timothy, relate to the sisters in the community. Relate to the young women in the community as your sisters. Now, I had a very honest girl come to me one time. I taught on that. And she came and she says, I am so tired of the brothers relating to me as a sister. And I go, well, what do you want them to relate to you as? A future wife. Okay? So just chill out, have fun, get casual, and, it'll work itself out. And I believe this, at least of our group. One of the reasons guys don't date is because they mature slower. That doesn't mean you're better girls. They just mature slower. Another reason they don't date in our guys is they project further out on the responsibility of the relationship. And they're going, I can't even afford to buy underwear. How am I going to dress her? You know? And even though you say, oh, I'm going to have a job, and then, yeah, but what if you have a baby? Oh, I hadn't thought about babies, you know? And a third reason is, I think this is common in our group at least, guys don't date because girls are projected for so long in Disneyland that they can just see when they call the girl up and she says yes, there is so much hope just oozing out of their pores. Oh, this could be the guy. And they're thinking, I just want to have a Coke or spaghetti, you know? You know, sexually I'm fast as can be, but socially and relationally, commitment-wise, I'm a slow processor. Chill out, girls. Okay? Put your head under a pillow, scream, and laugh. Tell all your girlfriends, not on Facebook, person to person, all your dreams about outdoor weddings. Do not talk about it for weeks with a guy, if not months. Okay? Okay? Yeah, maybe when he says, where do you think the venue should be? Oh, I've always wanted an outdoor wedding, you know. Okay? So we're going to have to figure this thing out because there's so much desire, which is good and godly, so much anxiety and expectations and all that stuff. You're just going to have to find some ways to laugh at it and have fun with it and just remind each other, we're just going out for spaghetti. You know, just tell yourself that. We're just going out for spaghetti. You know, Brandon suggested that you maybe, you know, if you define dating within your groups as it's socializing with a person of the opposite gender. You know, of course, if you do it in a crowd, that makes it a little easier. But even if you do it alone, you know, the thought that, you know, don't, you know, that whole exclusive thing, you know, well, we're not exclusive. We just don't do anything with anybody else. You know, that's exclusive. Okay? You know, if you kind of have an open-hearted covenant as a community of students and say, this is our definition of it. This is what we're signing on for. This is how I'm going to interpret it. Even though I wish it was something else. It's not spaghetti, it's marriage and children, you know. But I'm going to live with the definition. That might help you, you know. And that way, if you see him with somebody else, you're not jealous because, it's just spaghetti. You know? It's when he's asked you out for spaghetti multiple times and you don't see him asking anybody else out, you go, this isn't just dating. In our community, you know, we figured out some of this, not as a whole community, but you know that dating is dating, and until you have that conversation where the guy says, I want to intentionally pursue you, because our girls, too, want the guy to do it, okay? So guys, just suck it up and meet social expectations here, okay? Now, you notice, guys, now I get the amen from the girls group. You know, the other stuff, they weren't saying amen when I was on them at all, okay? So, you know, that's where I think a DTR is, you know, when you realize, wow, we are doing this enough that it's liable to create confusion and question. I need to define, I need to commit one way or the other. Okay? And so then, you know, this couple I told you about that had the, you know, really strict covenant and they didn't kiss till the end, the guy approached her after they had just socialized in various ways as small group leaders, and he said to her, he said, I want to ask if you'll give me permission to consciously pursue you. I would like to know if there could be permanence here. And I don't know. And I'm willing to risk to find out, even though we might be disappointed to discover no. And she said, I'll take the risk with you. Okay? Some point, that conversation in a non-matching culture has to take place. In a sexualized culture like ours, we've thrown away all the rules of courtship. You don't come to the girl's house anymore and sit in the front room with the piano with the mother. It was very protective to women. Very protective. Women had the power in that sitting. The man had to make his intentions known that they were honorable. When it switched over to a dating culture, sociologist at Chicago writes about this. She said it switched over and the man became the environment became the power of the man. The woman was out of the home. The man didn't have to relate to the protecting parent. There wasn't any social public nature of it. They were out on it. They began to go out into the public square. There began to be an exchange of finances, the man paying for it. It implicitly gave an unconscious statement of owing back something, which eventually oftentimes became sex. And she said, this sociologist says, it moved from where the woman was protected effectively from the more aggressive nature of the male pursuit and could monitor the relationship and the pace of it. When it got over here, the weight went to the power of men. Okay. Now we've moved to where, we're also socialized in the public square, that some of that's not necessarily the case. But what she was also saying was all the rules of courtship got thrown away. And so part of what's so hard for you trying to navigate this is there aren't any helpful rules, are there? There isn't any sense of what's modest or what's appropriate or, what's the guy's role, what's the girl's role. Feminism and all kinds of stuff just wiped all that off. Some benefits have come out of those movements, but also some real confusion. And so you may have to find together, what are some helpful things that we say, this is how we understand how to relate with each other as God's disciples, Jesus' disciples in the 21st century. And what you choose to do might just catch fire and go across the country and help lots of young men and women of your age. And Shirley and I would hope that. We echo and amen what these two guys, one married, one single, said. We are excited when we see young couples who deeply love Jesus march through this adventure of discovery, go through premarital, find that they've got good strength and compatibilities, end up married, and we get to watch their lives unfold for the next 20, 30 years like we've got to. We're very pro-relationship, but we hate divorce because God hates it. And the reason God hates it is because it tears the souls out of human beings and it desecrates the advantages of children. And you've got to learn to hate divorce. And so you're going to have to find ways to manage forward in a culture that is going to become more aggressively denunciatory of your modesty, of your peculiar old world values, of your carefulness, of your celibacy. And they're going to mock you. They're going to mock you in their humor. They're going to mock you in their movies. They're going to mock you in their songs. And so you will become God's peculiar, light, salt, witness people, giving hope for the power of love between a man and a woman. Pretty good thing to be called to do.
Just one final thought, because I know we have to go, but while you wait, there is so much you can do. You can grow to be the kind of person that God wants you to be. One thing I really learned during the time of my life, even though it was a difficult time when I was a single parent, was that, and I'd read this text in Isaiah where it says, your Creator, the God Almighty, will be your husband. I thought, what in the heck does that mean? I wanted a real man, I wanted a real person. And
me?
No.
Oh,
And,
no.
I mean, yeah. But what God showed me during that time is that Jesus really did become my husband. I mean, he had to put this broken woman back together again. My identity was like a big zero. I'd been betrayed. I'd been replaced by younger, more beautiful something. And so I felt pretty bad about myself. So God took this broken person, and he had to start teaching me what it meant to have my identity rooted in him. And so I just tried to learn all that he wanted me to learn during that time in my life in becoming this person that he wanted me to be. My first husband because of pornography and all other kind of perversion sexually, tried to create me into this person that he could love. So after I, in my naivety and youngness, tried to become this person, then he left. So I was devastated. But so during this time, Jesus truly did become the joy of my life. And he can do that for you too. I didn't want to get married. At first I didn't even know how I could live without a man. And maybe some of you are sitting there and think, I don't know, I don't think I could live without a mate, It becomes such an idol to us. And I realized that so much of my life was based on, I put too much security in that relationship. So before I got remarried again, I hated men at that point. I thought they were all jerks. I didn't never want to do this again. So God had to teach me a lot of things, and but he became the most important thing in my life, and Jesus was everything to me. Brady he's not my ultimate happiness and joy in life. Jesus is.
Yeah.
Jesus is enough for me to be satisfied and fulfilled. Sure, if something happened to him, I'd be sad and I'd miss him and there'd be grieving. But my relationship with Jesus is where my joy is. And that's what you can, as you wait for perhaps marriage someday, just grow and become all that Jesus wants you to be.
Yeah.
You just can't go wrong in that. And it's attractive. We know some girls or guys they want marriage so bad and they want relationships so bad, they're just like stuck. They're just waiting. They're not growing. They're just stuck. They don't want to do anything. That's not attractive. It's attractive to other people when you are developing your character and you're growing and you're moving. You're going on mission trips. You're doing stuff for Jesus. That's attractive. And that's what we have something to do about. We can grow and change.
A young lady by the name of Therese came to Jesus in her first year of college. Girls in her dorm reached out to her. She'd been raised a Roman Catholic, had a deep sense of values, but hadn't found the power or the personal relationship with Christ to live them, and found through some CCF gals in a small group a living relationship to Jesus. She was raised in a tradition of large families, the power and the joy of marriage, etc., and very much wanted to be married. And at a missions conference, the Lord spoke to her and says, I have made you for Ceylon. For Sri Lanka. And so she went and looked it up, and she couldn't find it on her map. You couldn't Google in those days. And she finally asked a friend, says, that's the island of Ceylon off of India. And she says, so she started reading about Sri Lanka, and she discovered that it was in the midst of an incredibly horrific civil war. And God spoke to her and said, you are to go when you graduate. And she deeply wanted to have somebody to go with her. She deeply wanted to be married. But she said, the Lord is good. The Lord will provide. The Lord knows me. And I will trust the Lord. And so she went. 22-year-old girl plunges into Colombo, Sri Lanka in the midst of the height of the Civil War in one of the most poverty-stricken nations of the world. She begins to pick up children, kind of like a Mother Teresa of Calcutta. She was our Mother Teresa of Colombo. And she eventually would adopt 19 children. She met a young pastor that she began to work with in terms of missional work in Sri Lanka. Name was Roger. Roger Kulmir had been trained at the University of Nebraska and had been part of a Chi Alpha group there as an international student. They grew to love one another. They eventually would marry each other. They would have 3 of their own children. When the tsunami hit Sri Lanka, Trelevan Kulmir was on the leading edge of the Christian witness of mercy and compassion and care. God had made her an influence in the nation. Now, does every story end up that you not only get to influence a nation and you get 19 kids as a single mom and you get to have an orphanage that's supported by Americans back home, and then you get a fabulous guy who loves Jesus and is a pastor over multiple churches and is training ministers all over the nation. No, you might not get their whole story, But what I liked about her is what Shirley said. She said, God has called me to go. God has called me to follow. I refuse to sit at a green light in my Volkswagen van waiting for somebody to get in. When she met Roger, Roger fell in love with her courage, her passion, her missional vision, and the fact that she had found ways to touch the world completely separate from him. Because Roger was going. So I want to just underline what she said. What's attractive to a man who's going in God is a woman who's going in God. Girls, you do not want a man who is not attracted to a woman who's going in God, because you will have to be his spiritual mother. And you don't want to be that. You want to be a spiritual friend and mate. Guys, it's hard enough on the sisters with the temptation of decent non-Christian men who pursue them because they're attracted to their character. You might just want to step up and at least give them social relationships that help fill some of the void of a culture that says sex and love together is the most important virtue of all, even though we know it's not. So let's serve one another wisely. Thanks for listening to us. Great questions. No, great questions to you. Okay?